Shalom, Shalom, Jerusalem， 平安之城是你的名。Shalom, Shalom, Jerusalem， 愿你平安。哦，耶路撒冷的儿女，听我为你唱，唱首平安的歌，平安的歌。蓝白色国旗在晴空飘扬，年轻士兵神采轩昂。3000年历史里有太多故事，主已将你召回，不用再流浪。你是主眼中珍贵的头人，也是他草场上的羊。Shalom, Shalom, Jerusalem， 平安之城是你的名。Shalom, Shalom, Jerusalem， 愿你平安。
各位敬爱的牧长同工、弟兄姐妹、朋友们，首先愿在主内问候大家平安。我是陈少豪牧师，仅代表橄榄树国际事工 Olive Tree International 的全体同工，欢迎各位加州湾区、全美各地以及中国大陆、香港、台湾和东南亚各地区的牧长、弟兄姐妹以及朋友们参加今天的专题讲座。本系列专题讲座的主题是犹太人的文化、信仰与智慧，透过 Zoom 在网上举行。OTI 的系列讲座分了3个系列，第一系列是认识犹太人的文化，第二系列是认识犹太人的信仰，第3系列认识犹太人的智慧。今天则是第3系列的第4场，也是全系列讲座的第14场。讲座题目是新约中耶稣基督的智慧，讲员是以色列圣经学院的卓香柏院长。讲座开始之前，我们非常感恩及荣幸请到温以诺教授带领我们一起为今天的讲座做开始聚会的祷告。温以诺教授是西方神学院跨文化宣教博士班的主任，曾经指导栽培了许多华人教会的宣教博士及宣教士，也曾担任大使命中心的副会长，与王永信牧师同工，致力鼓励华人众教会参加普世宣教。我们现在就请温以诺教授祷告，求神保守及赐福今天的讲座聚会。我们请温牧师。
我们一起祷告。谢谢主，在疫情里面让我们有用这样的方式来聚会。虽然我们弟兄姊妹在不同的国家、不同的地点、不同的情况，但是我们相信主的灵会在我们当中带领引导今天的聚会。求主眷顾保守，让整个流程顺畅，让我们没有什么的故障，让我们灵里面更清楚明白体会你的心意，有圣灵的引导，让我们讲的听的同感一灵，让我们在这次的聚会里面能更深的认识你，能更愿意爱你，好好的服侍你。求你垂听我们众弟兄姊妹同心的祷告，奉耶稣基督名祈求，阿们。
感谢主，感谢主，谢谢温以诺教授的祷告。温牧师也是我西方神学院的老师啊。接下来是我们献诗的时间，我们再次采用我心旋律音乐事工的创作《迈向锡安》专辑系列中希伯来曲调的诗歌《我的神，我的王》。我心旋律音乐事工的叶宏光牧师及邵家清师母在以色列地侍奉有10多年，他们常常在困难中仰望上帝。有一次，他们的心再一次被神的爱所吸引，而写了这首诗歌来表达对神的赞美。耶和华，你是我的神，我的王，你是我们生命的依靠以及归宿。我们就来播放这一首《我的神，我的王》。
溪水
真是感谢上帝啊！我新旋律音乐事工的叶红光牧师和叶嘉清师母创作如此美好的诗歌献给上帝，真是感恩。他们仰望上帝赞美神的心值得我们学习。接下来讲座开始之前，我来为大家介绍今天讲座的内容及讲员。首先我们讲一下今天讲座的内容。主耶稣基督30岁出来传讲悔改之道，3年半期间，他除了传道、关爱世人、医病赶鬼，施行许多神迹奇事。本讲座将依据新约马太、路加等福音书列举为您讲解。耶稣的一生显明了神的智慧和权柄。耶稣用他的智慧证明他是耶稣基督，是弥赛亚。耶稣乃是所有智慧的总结。讲员也将分享犹太信仰与弥赛亚耶稣的关系，以及今日上帝在全世界犹太人和以色列当中的作为。接下来我来介绍一下今天的讲员。讲员是卓香柏博士 Dr. Eric Shorif， 是以色列圣经学院 Israel College of the Bible ICB 院长，以及 One for Israel 事工的会长。卓院长在海法大学获得社会学和跨学科研究学士，赴美在惠顿学院进修，先后取得心理学和神学硕士和心理学的博士。2003年，卓院长加入 One for Israel 事工，并担任 ICB 教务主任，继而担任院长。他致力于服侍犹太人和阿拉伯人的领袖和学生，发表了许多有关于弥赛亚信徒之认同为主题的文章和书籍，以及关心弥赛亚信徒与列国基督徒的合一。那我们今天呢，非常的抱歉，因为由于我们安排的讲座的日期都是在礼拜五晚上，所以今天我们的讲座刚好是以色列周六的早上，两边都是犹太人的安息日期间，卓院长无法亲身上我们的 Zoom 我们的会场来一起讲解，所幸有变通的办法，卓院长提供的预录的视频我们可以播放。为了节省翻译的时间，我们制作中文字幕。卓院长的信息大概有50分钟，所以我们就现在开始播放卓院长的讲座，请。
God is working in a mighty way among the Jewish people today. Actually, he works so mightily that it reminds us of the book of Acts and the way God has dealt with our people at that time. Now, unfortunately, many parts of the global church are not even aware of what God is doing among the Jewish people, while other parts of the global church that are aware are under confusion as to what it means, all that God is doing among the Jewish people. And as always, when there is confusion among God's people, Satan is trying to get in and kind of exacerbate this confusion. So we want today, in the next 40 minutes or so, talk about several issues that hopefully will clarify some of the potential confusion. So in the next 40 minutes, we want to talk about Yeshua, Jesus our Messiah, as the ultimate wisdom and authority of God. We want to look at the Gospel of Luke chapter 5 and at the Messianic miracles that are taking place over there. We want to talk briefly about the Pharisaic Rabbinic Judaism, what happened in the Jewish world since the time of Jesus until today, and this mystery of the partial blindness of the Jewish people. And finally, we want to talk about, in some detail, but briefly, on what God is doing among Jewish people today, all over the world, and especially in Israel. So the first question we want to ask is, what are Messianic miracles? We read in Matthew chapter 11 and verses 4 and 5 that Jesus answered the disciples of John the Baptist, and he said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." In this short passage, Jesus, Yeshua, is directly referring to very famous verses from the book of Isaiah in chapter 35, verses 4 to 6. This passage details some of the things that the Messiah will do, and therefore the title Messianic Miracles, that will help us identify the Messiah when he comes. And this is the big question. How are we going to know the Messiah when he comes? The Jewish people ask that question all the time. The answer of the Hebrew Bible is there are many, many different details given about the Messiah, one of which is those Messianic miracles. Major way of identifying the Messiah. These are miracles that only he can do upon coming. And so with this as an introduction, let's turn to Luke chapter 5. I want to read with you verses 12 to 16. "And it came about that while he was in one of the cities, behold, there was a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and implored him, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' And he stretched out his hand," Jesus that is, "and touched him, saying, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' And immediately the leprosy left him. And he ordered him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest, and make an offering for your cleansing, just as Moses commanded, for a testimony to them." But the news about him was spread even farther, and great multitudes were gathering to hear him and be healed of their sicknesses. But he himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. So it's a very famous occurrence where a man that is a leper, full of leprosy, Luke the doctor tells us, comes before Jesus. Leprosy, you probably know, or you may know, that is a infectious skin disease that is characterized by disfiguring skin sores that eventually manifest in nerve damage and progressive debilitation. Until the 20th century, there was no cure for leprosy, and it would eventually lead to a very, very painful death for the person that had it. Throughout history, including Bible times, including times of the New Testament, lepers were cast away from society. There's a wide array in the ancient Near East and Asian world, all over the world really, a variety of religious ceremonies and rites performed that actually indicate the social death of the leper. Social death. And, in the Bible itself, Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 deal with this issue exclusively with the issues of leper, how to identify them, how to behave towards them, their fate, and as we'll see also in chapter 14, the healing of the leper. I want to turn with you to Leviticus chapter 13. I want to read a couple of verses. Again, we can't read the whole chapter, but verses 44 to 46 talk about how is the leper man to behave once he's identified. So verse 44. "He is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His infection is on his head. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." So in these short verses, we have the social and ceremonial and familial ramifications of leprosy to the leper. And we see that, first of all, he had to be examined by the priest in ancient Israel, and the priest, once identified the leprosy, would announce him unclean. And it translates here as surely announce him. It's actually in the Hebrew, he's unclean, is surely unclean. It's like really super unclean. And the uncleanness is not just physical, but it's primarily spiritual. He cannot come before God. He cannot come to the house of God. His physical appearance will be able to be identified by others immediately that he is a leper. And so he'll cover his face all the way to his mustache, to the nose. His hair is going to be just disorganized. His clothes are going to be torn. And wherever he walks, he has to tell in advance that he's approaching. He has to shout, unclean, unclean. And so that was his experience, to be an outcast, to live outside the camp, lonely, both physically, socially, spiritually. And, that's the biblical account. In the Mishnah, in the traditional rabbinic writing, there's actually many more details that were added as to the leper and his casting out. Now, for the leper, the day that he was pronounced unclean is actually a social death. It's the last day he will see his family, from some sort of a proximity. He can only see them from a distance. He can't live with them any longer. Just a terrible, terrible day for him and his loved ones, or her. Now, it's interesting, the leprosy touches the skin. The skin is medically known as our biggest physical organ. For every person, it's the biggest organ in the human body. It's called the external brain. And the reason it's called that is because our skin is in most cases, the first line of defense against everything that happens outside of body, any external stimuli. Now, there have been some very famous and interesting experiments done with both monkeys but also babies in orphanages following World War II that demonstrate, for time's sake I'm not going to go into it, but they demonstrate in no uncertain terms that as humans, and actually as created beings, we need touch. And as humans, we need physical human touch to survive, not just to thrive, but to survive. And so that kind of emphasizes for us that the leper, from this day on that he's pronounced a leper, will never, ever again have a loving human touch. Actually, in many cases, we read about that even in the biblical accounts, that people would, stone them or hit them with sticks. When children would see them, they would run away shouting. Just very, very, very sad and harsh reality for the leper. In the Hebrew Bible, we see that there are some famous lepers. Of course, there's Miriam, Moses' sister. There's Naaman, the Aramaic general. But here's the most amazing and most important fact to understand. In recorded Jewish history, in the Hebrew Bible and beyond, there's not any record of a leper that was healed. No leper was ever healed. So in that respect, Leviticus chapter 14, that talks about the different steps to be taken when a leper is healed, are completely theoretical. And this is one of the reasons that healing the leper is a miracle of messianic magnitude. It's only the Messiah that can perform such a miracle. Now, for time's sake, we're not going to go there, but I welcome your interrogation, or just look at Leviticus chapter 14. Look at the 3 stages of cleansing. So, as I said, completely theoretical, but if a leper feels that he is healed, then he needs to call, he cannot go there, but he needs to ask that a priest would come to see him. This is under the Sinai covenant. The priest would come to see him. He comes outside the camp, he gives him some sort of an initial examination, and if the priest is positive that there is a possibility that the leprosy is healed, then the leper sacrifices 2 birds. One is slaughtered, one is released, signifying the potential new life that he may have. And then the leper, on the second phase, the leper has to shave all of his body, all the hair on his body, and sit under supervision of the priest for a whole week. During that week, the priests are conducting some sort of an investigation. They say, was he really a leper? If he was announced a leper, and there's a record in the temple for that. Second, is he really healed? So during this week, they examine the wounds, and they see if they're truly healed. And if he is healed or she is healed, if the leper is healed, then what are the circumstances? What caused that absolute miracle? Now, on phase 3, if the leper is indeed healed, he would sacrifice 4 different types of sacrifices: guilt offering, sin offering, burnt offering, and grain offering, which symbolizes his return to a fellowship with God and man. So, we see that in our chapter, in Luke chapter 5 and verse 12, Luke, the doctor, tells us that the man was full of leprosy. That means that he's in an advanced stage of leprosy. He had that for some years. He probably is actually not only disfiguring physically, but likely his situation is so bad that he's near death. So, what's the greatest need of this man? It's not just the physical healing. It's first of all acceptance. And we'll see that in what he asks Jesus to do. I think that echoes our need for acceptance at times, that we come to our God and to our fellow brothers and sisters. And that's a great need for each one of us. Now, the biggest risk that the leper could take is actually do what he did. He's probably a leper at this point in time for years, maybe decades. He is used to be stoned and hit with sticks and, everybody running away from him, not wanting to get close to him. It's a huge risk for him to run to Jesus. Actually, it's a risk of death, literal death, to run to Jesus, fall at his feet, and beg for mercy. First of all, he doesn't think that anyone can have pity or mercy on him, but he takes that great risk. And what does he ask Jesus? He says, Jesus, I know you can heal me, but do you want to? Are you willing? I know you're able. If you want, if you're willing, I know you can heal me. So he has trust, he has faith in Jesus' power, not so much on his will. Am I worthy of your goodness, Lord, is basically the question that he's asking. Now, it's easy to imagine the reaction of the disciples. Now, they're probably drawing back when this man comes forward. Peter maybe gets a sword or a stick or something's like, Lord, get back, I'm going to hit this guy for you. But as we see, Jesus' reaction is very, very different. And what did Jesus need to do to heal the leper if he was willing? What did he need to do? What does God need to do in order to create? He just needs to speak. When God says something, it's done. It's created. It happened. And that's all that Jesus needed to do. But what did Jesus do? And that's very important. He stretched out his hand and he touched him. That was unthinkable. In the Hebrew Bible, when something clean touches the unclean, the clean becomes unclean. But in Jesus' case, when he, as the clean, the pure one, touches the unclean is becoming pure or clean. And that's exactly what happened. This is the touch of Jesus. The leper, we read, is healed immediately. And Jesus tells him, tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing, just as Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. And we can only imagine what it would be like in the temple for the leper to come and say, I was healed. Calling the priest, first of all, probably outside the camp. And, Jesus' healing was complete. We read that the leprosy disappeared altogether. They go to the records and they see, okay, this man, son of that man from this family and that tribe, indeed, X amount of years ago, he was declared a leper. And yet, he stands here healed. How did he heal? What happened? So we can only imagine what took place. As he tells them, a man named Jesus healed him. Now, this, important to understand, is a very important step in the candidacy of Jesus' messiahship. I'm going to explain what I mean by that in just a second. But it's a powerful testimony of Jesus' messiahship to the Jewish leadership of the day. Let's continue with Luke chapter 5 for the next Messianic miracle. I read verses 17 to 19. And it came about one day that he was teaching. There was some Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting there who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. And behold, some men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were trying to bring him in to set him down in front of Jesus. And not finding any way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down through the tiles with his stretcher right in the center in front of Jesus. So there seems to be some lapse of time between the time of the healing of the leper and the account of the paralyzed man. They both take place in the Galilee. But over here, it's interesting to note, we see both the multitudes, but very specifically, Luke is describing to us very specifically, there were teachers of the law, there were Pharisees from every village in the Galilee, and even from Judea, and even from Jerusalem, which was 3 days' walk. So for whatever reason, there was great interest of the leadership, the spiritual leadership of Israel, the Sanhedrin at the time, in Jesus. Now, it is not an accident that it comes right after the issue of the leper. And we can imagine, again, how the leper goes out to the temple, they do all the investigation, they found out that Jesus healed him. And at that time, in the time of Second Temple Judaism, there was a specific procedure to find out the person's claim for messiahship. And the way it was done, the Sanhedrin would send a convoy or several convoys from them to conduct a 2-stage investigation of the person claiming to be the Messiah. And there was a great messianic expectation, so they created a procedure. So on the first stage, it was a stage where the delegation would only observe. They would only watch and listen, but they would not ask any question out loud. Only listen to the teaching and see what's going on. On the second phase is called interrogation. So in this phase, the leaders of the Sanhedrin would ask the candidate for messiahship, they ask him questions and examine his replies. Now, as we look through the gospel accounts, it's easy to see how there are times that those that are sent, like here, from the Sanhedrin are only watching, they're not asking, or at least they're not asking out loud. But in other instances, they're asking Jesus' question out loud. It's just the different phases. Now, at the end of those 2 phases, the Sanhedrin was gathering together, and they make a formal decision whether this person is the Messiah or not. Is he accepted as such or not? So, that's kind of the crowd that is in front of us. Paralysis, as probably we may know, is a medical condition that can be either from birth or as a result of an accident, but it usually means that the person is a paraplegic, cannot move his hands or his feet, and it's usually caused by some sort of a serious nerve damage, either to the muscles or to the spine. And the paralytic that is described here in this chapter, he is clearly unable to mobilize himself in any way, and he's completely dependent upon his environment. We're going to mention this in a second, but his environment, in this case his friends, seems to be a pretty loyal bunch. Now, we have no idea how long this person has been in this state as a paralytic, whether it was an accident or whether this was something that happened from birth. We do know, however, he had friends that truly loved and cared for him. So even more than just a physical limitation, paralysis was also considered in Second Temple period, in biblical times, as a spiritual punishment, and certainly as a spiritual uncleanness. We read in Leviticus 21, verse 18, no one who has a defect shall approach, that is the altar, a blind man or a lame man, or he who has disfigured face or deformed limb. So paralytic could not, he was ceremonially unclean, could not come to God. We read in Deuteronomy 15:21, but if it has any defect such as lameness or blindness or any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. So it goes both for the one bringing the sacrifice, the worshiper, and also the sacrifice itself. Now, what we do see in this account in Luke 5 is that the paralytic's friends are a pretty tenacious and loyal group of people. They were not able to approach. They really wanted to help their friends. They had faith that Jesus can heal their friend. And as they bring him, they see that there are just too many people. They simply cannot approach and enter the house. And in true Israeli form, they start to improvise. They go to the roof. They take the roof apart and they lower the stretcher with the bed, the bed or the stretcher that he had. So perseverance here in action. And Jesus specifically mentions that he sees that the friends have faith. That's a wonderful thing to say about someone, especially if it comes from Jesus. Let's read verses 20 to 26. In seeing their faith, Jesus said, Son of man, or son of Adam, your sins are forgiven you. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying in their heart, not out loud, who is this man who speaks blasphemous? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But Jesus, aware of their reasonings, answered and said to them, why are you reasoning in your hearts? Which is easier, to say, your sins have been forgiven you, or to say, rise up and walk? But in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise and take up your stretcher and go home. And at once he rose up before them and took up the bed he's been lying on and went home glorifying God. And they were all seized with astonishment and began glorifying God. And they were filled with fear, saying, we have seen remarkable things today. Pretty amazing account. Jesus is referring to the paralytic as Son of Man, or literally, he actually said Son of Adam, probably referring to his the fact that he has inherited the sinful nature from Adam, like the rest of the human race, under the Adamic curse of sin. And Jesus tells him, Jesus sees to the immediate, significant, the most real need of that man, and he tells him, your sins are forgiven you. The physical healing is not the main point. It's the spiritual uncleanness. Now, in the Sinai covenant, the term forgiveness of sins is actually fairly rare. And you can find it, basically it only appears in Leviticus chapters 4 to 6, where the different sacrifices are detailed. And if the sacrifice is offered in this specific way, particularly the sin offering and the burnt offering, it is said, and God will forgive the sin. So the language that Jesus is using here is very, very specific. In verse 21, we see the reaction of the scribes, the Pharisees, the learned ones that have come from the Sanhedrin. And we have to say, their theological understanding was 100% on target. They understood that Jesus is saying, I have the authority to forgive sin. They understood that Jesus is saying that he is God enfleshed, that took form of flesh. And so they're reasoning in their hearts, and they're not just blurting it out, although I'm sure they wanted to, because they are in the first phase of interrogation of the candidacy for messiahship, and therefore they do not ask questions at this time. Verse 22, as always, Jesus knows the heart of man. By the way, it's another characteristic that is unique only to God, and Jesus knows what's in their heart, and he demonstrates to them in their own language, in their own way, who he is. In his wisdom, he also demonstrates his authority. Now, in the Mishnah, in the Rabbinic literature, and that kind of began already in Jesus' day, there's a form of argumentation of proving something easy from something that's a lot more difficult. And this is why Jesus is asking them, well, which is easier? Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven? Or is it easier to tell him, get up and walk? Now, clearly, for a regular person, saying something is a whole lot easier, than to say to someone, to actually see a paralytic get up and walk. And so Jesus proves to them his authority. And, by doing that, by saying that or by doing that, Jesus is giving the Sanhedrin of the day, the people that were around there at the time, and also us, only 3 possibilities to choose from regarding who he is. And particularly among the Jewish people, I have some friends that I talked to about Jesus sometimes, and they said, yes, Jesus was a good man, he was a prophet, he was a teacher. Now here's the thing, Jesus never gave us this option. Because when he says, I have authority to forgive sins, when he does those kind of messianic miracles, there's only 3 possibilities. One, that he is absolutely out of his mind. He thinks he has authority, but he really doesn't. He has some sort of an illusion. So that's the first possibility, that Jesus is crazy. The second one is that he's a liar. It's all a show. He rehearsed that in advance with the paralytic to make the Sanhedrin and us think that he has this kind of authority. And the third possibility is that he's truly who he is, that he is God in the flesh that has the authority to forgive sins, and later on sacrificed himself and resurrected from the dead to justify anyone that believes in him. So these are the only 3 possibilities that Jesus gives us as to who he is. We read in verse 26 that all the audience was amazed, including the Pharisees and the convoy from the Sanhedrin. And they all were praising God, saying, we have seen wondrous things today. Again, referring to this messianic miracle. Now, if I try to put myself in the shoes of the Sanhedrin as to making the decision about Jesus' messiahship, it's kind of actually unthinkable to think that shortly after this, the Sanhedrin, some of which may have been there and seen it, and certainly all of them heard first-hand testimony as to what Jesus did, they have decided that Jesus is not from God, that he's not the Messiah. They decided that he is a liar. He's a blasphemous sorcerer. That was the formal decision of the Sanhedrin of the time. And that's truly amazing, because and it's a mystery. How can the leaders of our people 2,000 years ago be so blind? Paul is grappling with this in the epistle to the Romans, and in Romans chapter 11, he says in verse 32, this is Paul's words, for God has concluded them all in unbelief, talking about the Jewish people and the Jewish leadership, that he may have mercy upon all. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways, past finding out. So Paul is making a point, making an argument, and explains at the end of chapter 11 of Romans that God has submitted everybody to blindness and to sin, and actually caused partial blindness to the Jewish people from that day to this regarding the messiahship of Jesus. But he also says in verse 25 and 26, he says, for I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. The mystery is the fact that the Jewish people are blinded to the messiahship of Jesus, nationally speaking. So Paul is saying, I don't want you to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that the partial blindness or partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. What Paul is saying here, that there will be a time in the future where, nationally speaking, the nation of Israel, all the Jewish people that are living at that time that this will happen, will look upon him whom we have pierced and believe on him as our Messiah. We're not quite there yet, and the blindness of the Jewish people, Paul is saying in Romans 11, the riches of God in the Messiah went to all the world, to all the Gentiles. And if we look at the path of the gospel in those 2,000 years, we see it began in Jerusalem, began in Israel, went westbound, surrounded the world, as it were, and is coming back to Israel, to Asia and the Middle East, the Arab countries, the Muslim countries now. And now we're seeing the first fruit of a revival in Israel. Now, a couple of words about Pharisaic Rabbinic Judaism. Judaism as we know it today. What happened in the Jewish world since the time of Jesus and until today? Now, of course, as we said just now, the Jewish leadership in Jesus' day rejected his messiahship. And as a consequence, Israel as a nation, we have rejected him nationally. Now we read, of course, there were the disciples, there was tens of thousands of Jewish believers in Christ. We read about that in the book of Acts. Read that many priests were believers in Yeshua. However, several things that have happened have, after Jesus' resurrection, have alienated Jesus from the Jewish people. So in the year 70 AD, there was the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. And during that revolt, or the result of that revolt, the Jews stopped paying taxes to Rome. Rome came, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, killed the vast majority of the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the priests. They were the rich part of the Jewish population, lived in Jerusalem. They basically killed all of them. However, in 70 AD, the Romans still allowed the Jewish people to remain in the land of Israel, but not in Jerusalem, and certainly not to rebuild the temple. So the Jewish leadership went to the city of Yavne, closer to on the western coast of Israel, and over there from the year 70 AD until 135, a period of 65 years, was a very formative season in the life of the Jewish people that shaped the Jewish world to where it is today. So the beginning tenet is you cannot be Jewish and believe in Jesus. That was the basic tenet. The second tenet is only Pharisaic Judaism is a acceptable form of Judaism. So we said that the priests were destroyed in 70 AD. The Sanhedrin that had the majority of Sadducees now is comprised completely of Pharisees. There is a group of Jewish believers in Jesus that survived, but they are rejected. They're not accepted. And several things have happened, in the Jewish world. There were no more priests. There was no temple. So the Jewish leadership, the religious leadership among the Jewish people moved from the priests, the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, only God chose them, to rabbis. Now the big difference is, if only God chooses the Aaronic family as priests, a rabbi can become a rabbi only if 10 other rabbis lay their hands on him and pray for him. That's the only way from that time to this that anyone can be a rabbi. So the switch is enormous. The spiritual leadership is no longer chosen by God, but it's chosen by the Pharisees. Those are the rabbis until today. Beyond that, in the Jewish world, the process has begun of developing the Hebrew text called the Masoretic text that also emphasized rejection of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a biblical translation to Greek, or the Hebrew Bible translation to Greek, done 200 years before Jesus' time. There was no Messianic argumentation at the time, and the Septuagint is demonstrating Jewish understanding of the Hebrew Bible pre-Second Temple period. or pre-Jesus, before there was a Messianic argument. But the rabbis reject that. And then the big question after the temple is destroyed is, how can we get atonement for sin? And the answer that is given is by giving alms for the poor and by prayer. And certain biblical passages or parts of biblical verses are taken out of context to justify that. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, is the way Jewish people look at sin until today. Basically, you don't look at it. And we certainly don't make any sacrifices. Now, this season concluded in what's called the second revolt against Rome, the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Jewish leadership of the day declared a very cruel army general called Bar Kokhba. They changed his name to Bar Kokhba, which is Aramaic for son of the star, which refers to the book of Numbers 24:17, or that talks about a star shall come out of David, a messianic prophecy, the words of Balak, and basically they declared him to be the Messiah. All the Jewish people gathered around him as their leader to fight the Romans and restore the kingdom of David. All the Jewish people except the Jewish believers in Jesus. They didn't join under his flag because they said, this guy is not the Messiah. We know the real one. That's Yeshua. That's not this guy. And so the Jewish believers didn't participate in this revolt that eventually in 135 AD resulted in complete annihilation of the Jewish population in Israel. Very few survived. The price of a Jewish slave was in Rome was less than a loaf of bread. There were just so many of them. So that's really 135 is when the second Jewish exile has begun. So when we talk about Judaism today, in our day and age, it's important we understand this is an offshoot, a direct offshoot of the Pharisees. And it's no accident that in the New Testament, Jesus is warning us against the Pharisees. Now, with all that, I'll say in a sentence, God has used Pharisaic Rabbinic Judaism to keep our nation, to keep the Jewish people. We were scattered around the world, persecuted with no land and no language for almost 2,000 years. And what kept us as a nation is the Rabbinic Pharisaic faith, if you will. And so today, here in the land of Israel, there's more and more Jewish people that claim Yeshua, Jesus, as our Messiah, and we share with our friends, with our families, with our neighbors, with our people this great news. You know, I want to ask another question here. Does a Jewish person need Jesus to be saved? Do Jewish people need Jesus to be saved, to believe in him? And the answer is absolutely yes. Yeshua himself says in John chapter 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No one, no matter who you are. A Jew, a Gentile, a Chinese, a Korean, no matter who you are. You cannot come to God except through faith in the Messiah, Yeshua. And therefore, not sharing the gospel with Jewish people is a terrible form of anti-Semitism. So make sure you take it to heart. The greatest need of Jewish people is not, humanitarian aid, and it's not public relations. The greatest need of the Jewish people is to hear about Yeshua of Nazareth in a way that they can understand, that they can relate. Now, I just want to tell you very, very briefly, I can't do justice to it, but just take a couple of minutes and tell you about what God is doing among Jewish people today, worldwide, but especially here in Israel. So in Israel, there are about 8.5 million Jewish people that are Hebrew speakers. That's the extent of Hebrew speakers around the world, about 8.5 million. Our evangelistic gospel films in Hebrew were viewed 44 million times. This is times five times the size of the Hebrew-speaking population worldwide. So the exposure of the gospel to our people in the last 7 or 10 years is absolutely enormous. And we get a tremendous response, both sometimes prejudices that are not so positive, but also many times quite positive. And we have the privilege of leading many of our family members, our neighbors, our nation to the Lord. But it's still important for me to emphasize, we're still a remnant. This is not the time that all Israel gets saved, but hopefully we're at the cusp of this. Beyond that, we live in a region, we read about that in the news all the time, that Israel is in conflict with our neighboring countries. The Jews are in conflict with the Arabs. This goes back 4,000 years to Isaac and Ishmael. And what we see today happening among our staff, among our students, among the people living in Israel and the Middle East, we see that Jewish people and Arab people, once we become followers of Yeshua, disciples of Yeshua, we love each other and we can serve the Lord together. This is something that we see day in and day out. We also have a very unique program of women leadership. Women in the Middle East are often marginalized and they don't get a place of not just leadership, but any voice whatsoever. So besides the ongoing pastoral leadership programs we have here at our college and seminary, we have a special program for women leadership. And we also, from here, from Israel, we share the gospel with Arabs and Muslims throughout the Middle East. We feel it's a blessing that the children of Isaac can also share with the children of Ishmael. So finally, I want to share with you what's the best thing that you can do the best thing you can do for a Jewish person. And I often meet people that God has put in their hearts the love that He has for the Jewish people, from studying His Word, from praying and being in fellowship with the Holy Spirit. They have a love from God to the Jewish people. And they ask, what can we do? And sometimes people go online and they give money as an expression to their love, and it's great. But please be prudent, because as I told you, what Jewish people most need is to hear the gospel in a way they can understand. So if you have Jewish neighbors or friends, present the gospel to them clearly. Make sure to use the language of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, not the New Testament, because Jewish people don't know the New Testament. It has no authority for Jewish people in their own eyes. It doesn't have any authority. However, there is some respect to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible. So get somewhat familiarized. You don't need to get to be an expert, but get a little bit of familiarity with the prophecies in the Hebrew Bible regarding the Messiahship, regarding the Messiah. How are we going to recognize him? So for example, Micah chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, not in other places around the world. When is the Messiah to be born? We read about that in Daniel chapter 9, particularly verse 26. We read about the suffering of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 53. We read about the death of the Messiah for sins, again in Isaiah 53 and verses 8 and 9. And we also read about the Messiah's resurrection in Isaiah 53 and verse 10. So these are just examples, but they can go a long way. So as we conclude, let me ask, who is Jesus for you? He's not just a prophet. He's not just a good guy. He didn't give us this option. And each one of us has to choose. Who is he? I'd like to proclaim before you that he is God's authority, God's wisdom, and he has all power. We can ask ourselves as we read this passage, are there areas in our life that we are unclean, that we need to come afresh to Jesus and take a risk, come to him, say, Lord, I need you to heal me from this part in my life. And we can also ask, are there areas that we are paralyzed, or, for Jesus to heal us, or are there people around us that need us to be like the friend of the paralytic, to carry them before the Lord. So I want to thank you. I want to bless you. I wish you God's blessing as you contemplate on the Messiahship of Jesus as it manifested in this chapter. Shalom, and may God bless you.
好的，非常谢谢卓香柏院长非常精辟的分享，传福音给我们的兄长以色列人、犹太人，也为他们祷告，爱他们，感谢上帝，让我们能够得以用这种录影的方式听到如此宝贝的信息。接下来有25分钟的 Q&A 的时间，还是一样，卓院长不能到我们现场。所以也是用预录的方式制作视频来进行。此段 Q&A 是我们 OTI 同工看了讲座录影之后提出问题，请卓院长来答复。一样的，如果我刚刚看到有人问问题，请继续欢迎打在 Q&A 的留言板上面，我们会收集你的问题，尝试的能够请院长或其他的同工来回答。email 回复你，谢谢合作。现在我们就来播放这段25分钟的 Q&A 的时间，请同工，谢谢。那此 Q&A 乃是我们 OTI 的同工看了录影之后提出问题，请卓院长来回答答复。好的，我们就请卓院长。
So, Dr. Eric, there's a first question. You mentioned about the Messianic miracles Yeshua has done. Is all the miracle he has done is called the Messianic miracle?
So it's a fantastic question, and thank you for bringing it up. Now, in one sense, all of the miracles that Yeshua, Jesus, performed are messianic miracles in the sense that the Messiah performed them. So that's in the broadest sense. However, I have used the term messianic in slightly different way, more narrow, as specific miracles that only the Messiah can perform. And I've given as an example, you may remember in Luke chapter 5, so the miracles were healing the leper, which never happened in recorded Jewish history ever since the Sinai covenant has been established. Miriam, the sister of Moses, was healed before the actual Sinai covenant was established. And so in that respect, it drew the attention of the Jewish leaders of the day to Jesus' messiahship. So, and similarly, the passage in the latter part of Luke chapter 5, where Jesus is healing the lame man, the man that was born paralyzed, is in accordance to Isaiah 35, is a miracle that signifies the Messiah himself. And so in that respect, there are the specific miracles that point out to the messiahship of Jesus. So I hope that clarifies the question a little bit.
Very clear. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the following question is, Yeshua is the salvation from God. It's all common knowledge in the Christian world. So why for Jewish people need a rabbi, religious leader, or Sanhedrin to recognize his identity? 我们基督徒都知道主耶稣是神差来的救主，那为什么犹太人还需要拉比、宗教领袖、公会来确定主耶稣的这个身份？
So Well, of course, it's a very, very good question. And part of the answer has to do with the specific period, 2,000 years ago, that the Messiah has come. So the expectation of the Jewish people for the Messiah at that particular time. And we're going to start there, and then we can expand the question to our current day and age, I think, to all nations. But specifically, 2,000 years ago, in the later years of the Second Temple period, there was a very significant messianic expectation among the Jewish people. Or in other words, the Jewish people, based on the timeline in Daniel chapter 9 and many other prophecies that seem to align and line up at that season, were expecting the Messiah to come. And actually around that time, there were several quote unquote candidates that have shown up and claim to be the Messiah. This is 2,000 years ago already. And so, there were several people that claim to be the Messiah. The question then become, well, who is really the Messiah? And you may remember that, even John the Baptist sent his disciples say, well, are you the one, or should we wait for another one? When Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? They said, well, some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're Elijah. He says, but what do you say? So there was this season of expectation. Of course, part of it was also the very strong subjugation of the Roman control over the Jewish people that caused the Jewish people to kind of expect the Messiah that would free them from the bondage of Rome, and so on and so on. So because this was the atmosphere, the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, that at that time they were the governing body of the Jewish people. It was actually a custom that was formed after the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So after the return from the Babylonian exile, the majority of the people at that time in the Sanhedrin were from the priestly families, the wealthy, important priestly family, particularly the family of Zadok, therefore the Sadducees, and a minority was from the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the simple people, mainly the disciples of Ezra and Nehemiah. And because there were many candidates, they have established a very specific criterion to determine who the Messiah is. And I referred to this in the message I've given. There were two stages, and the Sanhedrin then would, recognize. Now, unfortunately, according to the plan of God, but still unfortunately, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time determined that Yeshua, Jesus, is not the Messiah. And as a result, the majority of the Jewish people from that day until today, the majority of our people do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Now, Scripture tells us that it's going to change, and someday Israel nationally, not as a remnant, thank God it's a growing remnant now, but we're still a remnant. But one day will come that all of Israel will look upon him whom we have pierced. And so, we can take just another example of the expectation in Israel. So about 135 years, well, maybe 100 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the Sanhedrin of that time declared another person. His name is Bar Kokhba, is a very cruel army general, but they declared him to be the Messiah. And they called all the Jews to come under his flag and rebel against the Romans. And the vast majority of the Jews did. The only part of the Jewish people that did not come under this man's flag as the Messiah were the Jewish believers in Jesus. Because the Jewish believers said, this guy is not the Messiah. We know the real one, his name is Jesus. It's not this guy, Bar Kokhba, it's not him. And so, and I think we can still see this both in church history and probably until today. In church history, we see particularly, the people of Armenia. I think it was the 3rd or 4th century. The king of Armenia became a believer in Jesus. And as a result, all the Armenian people left their idols, and at least outwardly, I'm sure there were many that it was also an internal kind of a thing, repented and become followers of Jesus. So I think once the leadership decides something, it takes a lot of weight for the people that are following them. And so, to say why did the Jewish people need, it's kind of how it was in that day. Of course, now all of us, I guess many of us at least, live in a society that's a lot more individualized. And the place of the family leader and the tribal leader and the country leader may be diminished to some degree, but that was the situation.
Thank you, very helpful. 那接下来第3个问题就是刚刚我提到，就是信息主要是讲新约圣经当中主耶稣的智慧。那这么多提到他所行的神迹来自于神的权柄，是怎么样跟他的智慧相关 Yeah, so Dr. Eric's next question is the message is about Yeshua, Messiah's wisdom during the New Testament. So how all these miracles, Messianic miracle, it's from the power by the authority of God, how this relate to his wisdom?
So once again, a very good question. And, for Yeshua, he embodied in everything he did many, many qualities all at the same time. So his authority, his mercy, his wisdom, and the specific connection of the miracles to the wisdom, I think we can see it in the way that Jesus did the miracles in various different ways. Sometimes we read that Jesus had compassion, mercy on them, and therefore he healed them, or he did something for them. Other times we read he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, or a flock without a shepherd. In this instance, in Luke chapter 5, it's very interesting to see what he says to the leper. He says, don't tell anyone, but go tell to the priests. I mean, sacrifice you need to make, and tell to the priest. And that really, basically what Jesus was doing then, he was declaring, he was stating his messiahship to the nation of Israel. Because the leper, you may remember, he went to the temple, and then he told the priest, or at least he called the priest outside the camp, I guess, first thing. He says, I think I'm healed. I am healed from leprosy. The priest then, examines him, and in this case, he was completely healed. So he says, okay, we need to put you in quarantine for 7 days. And we have to look in the temple records. We find your name, you're so-and-so, the son of so-and-so from this tribe and from this family. And there's a record that says that you are a leper. You're unclean, you're outside the camp. But here you are, and you're healed. So this is something that never happened among our people since the Sinai covenant. So how were you healed? And he says, a man named Yeshua, Jesus, healed me. Then the priest at this point in time, he tells the high priest goes to the Sanhedrin. They say something very unusual happened. Okay, so I think in this particular instance, the wisdom of Yeshua is evidenced in the fact that he has chosen to bear testimony about himself in a very, very unique yet very specific way. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, okay. So 那我们进入下面一个问题。下面有一个问题就是，Dr. Eric 他是这个 One for Israel 的这个 CEO。那我们没有翻译这个名字，因为我们有一个问题，就是说这个名字的意思到底是指什么？特别是这个 One Yeah, so Dr. Iris' next question is about the name of organization, One for Israel. Some think one is referred to our Messiah. Some think it's about unity. So we like you explain what exact meaning.
So all those explanations are correct.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, of course, it is our intention that the one for Israel is the Messiah, Yeshua himself.
Mm-hmm.
However, we really enjoy to see different layers of meaning that different people give it. It's definitely also a call for unity in the global body of Christ. In this case, our ministry is to Israel. We believe, as Romans 11 tell us, that once Israel come to faith in the Messiah Yeshua, even a greater blessing is going to flow to all the world and all the nations than the time that Israel on a national scale have rejected the Messiah. So when we say one for Israel, or when you become one for Israel, you have joined to pray for the salvation of Israel and for Israel to become again, or even a greater way, an instrument to bless the whole world.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next question in very general. You sometimes mention Hebrew Bible, and in Christian world, we are familiar saying Old Testament and New Testament. So I did Chinese first. 我们很习惯称我们的圣经旧约圣经和新约圣经。那 Dr. Iris 常常提到希伯来圣经。那是不是就是我们的旧约圣经 So is the Hebrew Bible you mentioned is the same as the Old Testament that we are familiar?
Yes. So yes, I refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible. Yes.
Okay. Is that the exact same?
Yes, of course. Yes,
Okay.
It's completely the same. I say Hebrew Bible because I think sometimes, of course, Paul is using the term, the Old Testament, when he's making an apologetic discussion, I guess, on the exceeding validity and value of the New Testament, the New Covenant, which, of course, is wonderful and something that that's why we live for. But I think sometimes there could be in certain circles a wrong derogatory term of the Hebrew Bible, of the book of the Old Testament, as when you call it old, it has no bearing on my life. I don't need to read it. I don't need to study it. There's nothing to say to me. And that's very, very, very wrong. And so this is the reason I much prefer to use the term the Hebrew Bible and not the Old Testament.
那我自己也有一个问题，就是关乎这个信息当中提到法利赛人啊，就是比较负面，那也是让我们读新约书信、福音书里面，主耶稣指责法利赛人的时候，也很多的负面的印象。但我们知道使徒保罗他是法利赛人，那他写了大部分的书信，保罗书信呀，所以我想作为这一个背景法利赛人，但是他一旦认识主耶稣之后，这个背景是非常的有帮助来明白神的话。Yeah. So the question is about the Pharisee. It's kind of negative from gospel. Yeshua rebuked the Pharisees, and also your message mentioned about the history, the Pharisee and become the leadership. But we know Apostle Paul was a Pharisee, his background. So I think once he recognized the Messianic, Yeshua is Messiah, his background is very helpful to understand God's word. so he wrote so many letters. The question is, we kind of should not only negative to the Pharisee, right? Normally we are very negative to Pharisee.
Okay, so God has used the Pharisees in a very interesting way among the Jewish people. Because on the one hand, the Pharisees, one of the tenets, one of the main principles of Rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism is that Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, is not the Messiah. So we have a strong disagreement with the Pharisees, and I think that's part of the reason, that Jesus in his foreknowledge spoke and rebuked the Pharisees so very much. However, God has used the Pharisees and the Pharisaic Rabbinic Judaism to maintain the Jewish people as a nation. And, we were people for 2,000 years. We were a nation with no country, no language, and under severe persecution. And what kept us is the fact that we basically, as Jewish people, we were all Pharisees. And we were studying the Rabbinic Pharisaic writing, not the Bible, but these writings. And so God has preserved us as a nation through Rabbinic Judaism, Pharisaic Rabbinic Judaism, because he has a plan for the nation of Israel for the years to come. So in that respect, we disagree with the Pharisaic teaching, and the Pharisees, needs to be said, unlike the time of Paul, in this day and age, the Pharisees do not study the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. They study extra-biblical rabbinic writing. And I think sometimes, particularly Christians may have a uninformed view. They see an Orthodox Jew reading and praying, and they say, wow, how can they read the Bible every day, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and just never get it? Well, the reason is they actually don't read the Bible. They read other types of books, mostly, for the vast majority. And so definitely we need to pray for the Jewish people that are Orthodox or adhere to Rabbinic and Pharisaic, tenets or whatever like that. They are the people that we are serving, or at least some of them, at One for Israel, because among the Jewish people, there's only a certain amount or a certain percentage that are Orthodox. So I hope I'm answering the question.
Yes, thank you so much.所以就是Dr. Aris 几乎在解释他信息里面的有一部分，就是说主耶稣当时那个时候他成就救恩之后，是法利赛人否定他的弥赛亚身份。虽然他们看到了这个弥赛亚神迹，对他们来讲应该是已经非常清楚了，但是是他们作为领袖否定了。所以在马太福音23章，主耶稣那样子的严厉的指责他们，这是第一方面。那另一方面呢，神也用了这一批留下来的法利赛人，因为撒都该人已经被罗马政府都消灭了，都残害了，所以神用法利赛人使得犹太人保守下来，成为一个国家。虽然他们近2000年已经没有土地，没有语言呀，但是呢，神使得这一个法利赛犹太教这样的一个系统，使得以色列国家仍然是被保守下来。虽然我们并不同意他们的那些教导，因为他们好像我们看到现在很多以色列的正统犹太人一直在读经，那他们为什么没有认识弥赛亚？但实际上他们主要读的不是圣经，而是圣经以外的那些拉比的这些教导。所以我们作为主耶稣的门徒，我们就应该为他们来祷告。
谢谢因为 Q&A 的时间非常有限，非常谢谢我们院长的回答。如果 你还是有一些问题，还是可以将你的问题打在 Q&A 的留言板上面，我们同工会收集起来，然后我们会尽量的请讲员 Dr. Sorry 用 email 来回答你。谢谢这个 section， 我们就结束在这里。好的，再来谢谢刚刚的 Q&A 时间，我们来预告一下下一场 OTI 的系列专题讲座，规划是每一个月举行一场，所以现在来预告下一场，是从明年2022年开始，将是新的一系列的以色列末世警钟的第一场，预定于明年3月份，美西时间3月18号。礼拜五晚上7点到8点半的时间，那在亚洲的时间是3月19号，2022年礼拜六的早上10点到11点半的时间。讲员正是刚刚为讲座开始做祝福祷告的温以诺教授，题目是当今华人基督徒与游仙。欢迎大家预留时间来参加。最后我们是祝祷，我们请到的是在新加坡福音自传会 CNEC 的会长赖木生牧师来做祝祷。赖木生牧师也是温教授的博士班的学生。赖牧师多年来带领 CNEC 在东南亚、泰国、缅甸、柬埔寨等10多个国家推动宣教，向当地的人及偏远山区的少数民族传福音。赖木生牧师也非常关心游宣的事工，感谢上帝。现在我们就请赖牧师参加为这次讲座的全体同工弟兄姐妹和朋友做祝福祷告，我们就请赖牧师，请。
天父，我们感谢你，今天透过你的仆人的所提醒我们的，从圣经里面看见主耶稣基督彰显了他弥赛亚的能力，他能医治人的身体的疾病的能力，释放人心灵捆绑的能力，也使人社交关系和好的能力。天父，我们感恩，因为你是我们的生命的弥赛亚，你不单是彰显了你的能力，你更彰显了你的慈爱与怜悯。你来这个世界成为我们罪人的救主，救我们脱离罪的咒诅与捆绑。我们的主，感谢你，因为你欢迎罪人来挨近你，你伸出你的手来医治我们，释放我们，并拯救我们。主啊，我们的生命的弥赛亚，求你今天伸出你的手来医治我们。我们中间若有疾病困扰的，心灵受捆绑的，及人际关系破碎的，求主你的能力跟慈爱来医治我们。谢谢主来这个世界为我们的罪，如同献上的羔羊死在十字架上，成了我们救主，我们的弥赛亚。所以求主你帮助我们还没有认识你的朋友，今天也能够认识主耶稣是我们人类所需要的弥赛亚。主啊，求你今天帮助我们接受你弥赛亚的弟兄姊妹，让我们向你下拜，献上我们的感恩。愿主在我们的身上彰显你的救恩能力跟慈爱。我们继续为到犹太人的救恩祷告，求主开恩怜悯，求主圣灵更大的工作，透过我们跟很多的犹太的弟兄姊妹传道人，能够引领更多的犹太人来归向主。所以求主你自己恩待保守祝福我们， 但愿主耶稣基督的恩惠、天父上帝的慈爱、圣灵的感动，常与我们众弟兄姊妹同在，从今时直到永永远远。阿们。
阿们，阿们。感谢赖木生牧师的最后的祝祷。最后，非常谢谢各位参加今天的讲座，欢迎你继续给我们回应，也欢迎你继续的参阅我们 OTI 的网站 www.otiministry.org。我们的 website 上面有非常丰富的内容，除了有 OTI 的意象以及事工的介绍，还有过去每一场讲座的录影，另外有橄榄树园地，其中还有认识犹太文化以及关心以色列2个专栏，有好多好的文章，欢迎订阅。如果弟兄姐妹愿意支持我们橄榄树国际事工 OTI 的以色列事工，也可以请参阅 OTI 的网站为我们祷告谢谢大家。再一次的预告， OTI 的下一场的讲座是明年3月份美西时间3月18号，或者是亚洲3月19号。我们下次见，愿神祝福大家。最后，我们就用大祭司亚伦为以色列祝祷的祝福来祝福大家。愿耶和华赐福给你，保护你；愿耶和华使他的脸光照你，赐恩给你；愿耶和华向你扬脸，赐你平安。我们的工作成功，开我们的视频，向我们的朋友弟兄姐妹打打招呼，再见，谢谢他们的支持。
教授，谢谢赖牧师。讲座的长的
直到永远，纵观全地的大君王，让我们齐声赞美他。
小芬姐妹，谢谢阿雪儿，谢谢。
齐声赞美。